The National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine had a webinar yesterday to redefine long COVID. Before we dive into this, I want to give a little background on why it's important to have an updated definition. Currently, long COVID is defined as an umbrella term for over 200 different diagnoses, and that can be very overwhelming for medical professionals because they're like, well, what is included in that? What is not included in that? How do I address this? Which ultimately ends up in them not addressing long COVID. Recent literature that I covered breaks long COVID down into 4 different categories. The first being persistent symptoms after acute infection. This could be like developing a chronic cough that happened after your COVID infection, which would be an ongoing symptom from the start of the COVID infection to now. The next type is an exacerbation of symptoms. So, this is something like if you had asthma, and then once you got COVID, your asthma got worse. That would be another example of long COVID. You could have a completely new condition that pops up, like type 1 diabetes. And then they also bucket multi inflammatory syndrome in children or adults into a fourth category, which are sort of the 4 high level structures of long COVID. And then a lot of the literature actually breaks down long COVID into subsystems or subcategories, where you could have pulmonary or lung based long COVID. You could have endocrine based long COVID, like with diabetes. You could have a brain predominant long COVID, where it's the brain fog and the trouble thinking, a vascular long COVID, and etc. Where the first major issue is when you have such a broad definition is where do you actually go to get help? Where do you go to get care? How are these doctors supposed to refer you? So that's the problem if you make the definition too large. But then if you do the opposite, where you make the definition too tight and narrow, or if you take these 200 symptoms and break it down into, say, 40 symptoms, the issue then becomes one of equity with access to care, where insurance will then cover those 40 things. But if you have symptoms that are outside of the 40 things that are within the 200 things, then you wouldn't be able to get referred, you wouldn't be able to get insurance to cover it, and it would be very expensive out of pocket. And that's something that we saw with the AIDS crisis, where they had too tight of a definition, which made it so that a lot of people that had AIDS didn't qualify as having AIDS under insurance, or they had to do this huge uphill battle to get their symptoms to be qualifying conditions. So that gives us the basis of the tightrope that they're sort of walking with this definition, and also why they need to have an updated definition. So now let's dive into their 2024 long COVID definition. Their first goal is that patients with long COVID need to be able to understand the definition and then to be able to see themselves within that definition so that they may be able to advocate for themselves and for their loved ones to get care. The factors they considered within the definition of disease included attribution, the source responsible for causing the disease, or aka COVID, time-based factors, so the onset of disease and then when long COVID is considered, the clinical features like the symptoms, symptom duration, and severity of symptoms, equity implications, functional impairment of the disease on your daily activities, and your ability to perform work functions. If it's a disease of inclusion or exclusion, meaning that you test a bunch of things and exclude them out to get to that diagnosis, or simply that if you have these new conditions or these types of symptoms, then that would be inclusive of that disease. Biomarkers and lab criteria for which for long COVID there currently is none, and then any risk factors that have a higher probability of disease occurring. The first point in their terminology is that they wanted to emphasize the use of long COVID, that being the major definition. Currently, there's many different definitions. One of them is PASC, or post-acute sequela of COVID. Other people use post-COVID conditions, and there are a few other terms that people use, but they want to unify on the definition long COVID. The next phrase they want to use is infection-associated chronic condition, or IACC, to highlight that COVID is a trigger, that it causes chronic conditions, and these conditions have an ongoing nature, which brings us to the new definition that we need to adopt. Reading, long COVID is an infection-associated chronic condition that occurs after COVID infection and is present for at least 3 months as a continuous, relapsing, and remitting or progressive disease state that affects one or more organ systems. So let's break that down. This means that long COVID is a chronic condition that is triggered by a COVID infection. There needs to be 3 months of symptoms for the diagnosis, but these symptoms do not have to be continuous for 3 months. You can have a month of symptoms, a month of relapse, a month of symptoms, a month of relapse, and a month of symptoms, and that will still count. And like we mentioned earlier, it can affect one or more organ systems. So that can be like the endocrine system, the vascular system, the central nervous system, and etc. The next point they want to emphasize is that long COVID can manifest in multiple ways, and that any organ system can be involved with long COVID patients. You can pause and zoom here to look at the list. And the third feature of their definition, long COVID can follow asymptomatic, mild, or severe COVID infection, where previous infections may have been recognized or unrecognized, meaning that with this definition, a positive COVID test is not required. You do not need a positive PCR test to be diagnosed with long COVID. They emphasize that long COVID can affect children and adults regardless of health, disability, or socioeconomic status, and regardless of age, sex, gender, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, or geographic location. They emphasize that long COVID can exacerbate pre existing health conditions or present as new conditions, that long COVID exists on a spectrum from mild to severe illness, that currently there is no biomarker available to demonstrate the presence or absence of long COVID, and that long COVID can impair an individual's ability to work, attend school, take care of family, and care for themselves. And then they have this nice infographic that you can visit on their site. You can go to my YouTube channel for this video or for the full meeting video that I also have available. The link to that in their website will be available in the captions. In the infographic, they list some of the symptoms that are the most commonly occurring for long COVID, such as persistent fatigue, memory changes, recurring headaches, a lightheadedness or fast heart rate, sleep disturbances, shortness of breath, problems with taste or smell, and bloating, constipation, or diarrhea. But again, emphasizing at the bottom there that many other symptoms have been observed, that there are many diagnosable conditions associated with long COVID, such as cardiovascular disease, chronic kidney disease, interstitial lung disease, cognitive impairment, mood disorders, POTS, ME/CFS, lupus, Sjorgen's disease, fibromyalgia, diabetes, and mast cell activation syndrome, to name a few. Where again, I want to emphasize in this new definition that they emphasize that long COVID can affect children and adults, regardless of health status. Overall, I'm very happy with this definition. I think it's very good. And within this updated definition criterion, they plan to update the definition every 3 years or when new information becomes available. So, for everyone out there, clinicians, researchers, medical professionals, patients, advocates, this is the definition that you should be adopting.